Well, let's talk about what these crime stats mean in the broader context. Dr. Jean Redpath from the Dullah Omar Institute joins us from Cape Town. Appreciate your time this afternoon, Dr. Jean. Now, your research suggests that South Africa has one of the highest crime rates globally. How does the historical context, including the apartheid era, regional policing, impact the current structure of policing and obviously the distribution of crime in the country?
Sure, that's quite a lot of questions in one. So to address the historical context, we had a very, very high crime rate and murder rate in the late 90s and early 2000s, and then an absolutely unbelievable halving of the murder rate up until about 2010, and thereafter a slow but steady increase, and then in the post-lockdown period, quite a sharp and worrying increase in the murder rate, which is starting to take us back to the early part of our democracy. Now, the way our policing is arranged was one of the compromises that emerged out of the constitutional negotiations. Originally, in the interim constitution, we had an arrangement where there was some degree of responsibility given to provincial NECs over the National Police Service. We have a National Police Service. So it was still a National Police Service, but they had some degree of political responsibility and political oversight over policing within the provinces. In the final constitution, that was removed. And many of the functions which our provinces now have in relation to policing were in fact the functions given to community policing forums in the interim constitution. So in other words, a huge downgrade in the functions which provinces have in relation to policing. So in a nutshell, our policing is national, it's centralized, and it's run from the center of our country.
Well, Dr. Redpath, as we do every quarter, we are given these statistics that are horrific, particularly when you look at 209, I think, I can't remember if it's 193 or 293 children alone that were killed. In fact, a total of 1,188 women and children were killed in the last quarter. And every single quarter, we go through the same statistics and marginal variations. Do the police know how to deal with the challenges? One would imagine not.
So one has to remember that crime is not only a policing problem, it's a whole of society problem. And in fact, if we look at our trajectory, that trajectory of murder that I talked about, where we had this quite steep decrease, it was in the first part of that period that it was, in fact, the operation of policing together with our criminal justice system, a fantastic effort that was responsible in that early time period for bringing down the murder rate. However, subsequently, a sense of urgency disappeared, but and those initiatives that were very much coming from the state in trying to address the crime problem from various angles, not just the policing angle, dissipated. But luckily enough for South Africa, what was happening at the same time is our unemployment situation was improving, and that continued the downward trajectory up to about 2010. However, unfortunately, after that, we not only had a kind of state capture of our government, but also of policing, as well as a steady increase in unemployment. And that is what has driven the steady increase that we see thereafter. So what we really need is a return to that sense of urgency, that sense of crisis, and a whole of society approach to dealing with our crime situation.
Well, you raise an issue there of it's not just about the police force, but there are multiple other elements to the actual process of policing or dealing with crime, if you will. Now, Bheki Cele, the police minister, announced earlier that an operation called Chanela has resulted in the arrest of 99,000 suspects. That's almost 100,000, which is a significant number. But the question that arises is, where do they go? The prison population is saturated at the moment, and almost suggests that you can't take them into prison. If you take them into prison, then you're going to have to take some people out.
Well, interestingly enough, our prison population is actually at one of its lowest points in our history. It is overcrowded, yes, but it's at one of the lowest points in our history. And it's more overcrowded than it was because we've lost some bed spaces over time, with some prisons becoming out of commission. So, yes, where do we put them? It's not only prison that is an appropriate way of addressing crime. Certainly, serial violent offenders almost certainly belong in prison. And what we've got to do is make very good use of the scarce resource of a prison bed and ensure that the worst offenders are the ones that go into our prisons. Unfortunately, one of the things that happened over that time period where we saw that steady increase in crime is that we didn't get that balance right, and we were prosecuting very few serious violent offenders and replacing those prosecutions with other less serious offences. And that only becomes apparent when you go into detail into the data. So we need a return to the prosecutions and convictions of the most serious offenders and ensuring that those people are put away. For other kinds of offences, there may be various kinds of interventions that we can have. And in fact, in our early time period of our democracy, we were very creative with those interventions, and they worked, particularly with young people for whom, putting them in prison if you're very young might be the worst thing that you can do for the long-term trajectory. But we don't do that anymore, and that's part of the problem.
Dr. Redpath, you raise an issue about, let's go back to yesteryear, where people can be sentenced or kept behind bars for the crimes that they commit. But all of this speaks to our ability to arrest individuals and make the crime stick. Now, there's a case of two brothers, the Governor brothers, in Phoenix, who weren't sentenced or weren't charged with murder of an individual because the police did not have sufficient evidence. There's another case of the Senzo Mayiwa case where the judge has blown holes in the work of the police force. Now, just how much are the police lacking in their ability to police as they should, particularly where crimes have been committed?
So the problem is not a lack of arrests. We've got a lot of arrests, and the problem is the right arrests. It doesn't help to arrest the wrong people, and it doesn't help to arrest if you cannot build a case. And we've seen a great deal of problems, particularly with our forensic services, with the DNA database. Those are the kinds of things that are crucial to serious and violent crime. And we really need to get those things right and get the serial offenders behind bars. So arrests for the sake of arrests and chasing targets is not going to help us at all. And we have another problem of that they need to be prosecuted. So if you arrest someone and it doesn't lead to a prosecution, it doesn't necessarily help the situation. And if you arrest the wrong person, that also doesn't help the situation. We need to be much more targeted and much more focused on particularly organized crime, getting the kingpins in organized crime. And we had such a strategy in Gauteng aggravated robbery strategy, which was particularly targeted on the organized side of hijackings and violent robberies. And that had a massive impact on the data, which you can see if you go back in time. No. Unfortunately, that program was stopped, and slowly things came up again.
Now, Dr. Redpath, you bring up the issue of strategy, and one of the challenges that you suggest is that police employ the same strategy for dealing with all criminals across the country, a blanket approach for criminals in Khayelitsha versus criminals in Alexandra, in Johannesburg, for instance.
Yes, so what is similar across the country is the structure of police stations, the ranks, the way things are organized within police stations. But there may well be slightly different strategies within particular policing areas. And they may be able to draw on the resources, other resources, for example, Metropolitan Police, who have certain obligations, particularly in relation to domestic violence in the legislation. So, but as you are correct in the sense that with a centralized organization, the priorities are nationally determined. And yes, the provincial commissioner does have control over his or her own province, but that is within the constraints of a national framework, national laws, and national ways of doing things. And in fact, the hiring is national. So all of that contributes to a kind of uniformity of approach, which in some is not necessarily a bad thing, but it does remove the flexibility that might be available for innovative commissioners.
Dr. Redpath, appreciate your time this afternoon. Dr. Jean Redpath, Senior Researcher, Africa Criminal Justice Reform at the Dullah Omar Institute.